Good. Okay, so I did a quick intro at the very beginning, but basically I'm the product manager at Google for all of the identity and authentication APIs, basically helping all kinds of apps and developers make sign in and sign up easier. I've been at Google for probably 3 or 4 years working on this, but before that I actually worked at Facebook. I did the original Facebook Android SDK in 2010 and have been working on APIs for almost 10 years. And even on the flip side, like as an app developer myself, even helping some friends in New York here build an app and start a company. So basically, in all of that time, I've looked at quite a few different apps and different ways to get people signed in and signed up. And there's really a breadth of things that people do, and some that work really well and some that have a variety of problems. And in looking at all of these apps and websites that are out there, there's a couple of common patterns that I think are really interesting that work really well. And there's some that are new and emerging that I would love to highlight here and get people's thoughts and feedback on. So if you ever have any questions about this, you can just send me an email. I'm sso@google.com there. And happy to chat and look at apps you're building, ideas you have around Auth user experience, making it better, making it more secure, and so on. So to kind of get started, I have a little story that like in New York, almost 100 years ago in the 1920s, there's this Prohibition era. And to get a drink or something, you'd have to go down this dark alley and find your way through the stairs and knock on a door, and you'd have to say your name and say a kind of a secret code or secret password or something to get in. And the reality is that 100 years later, you can order your drink online, it'll get delivered to you, but you still need to know that username and password. So, some things have become better and some are really stuck. And I think that's one of the underlying themes and, points that I make about authentication these days. The experiences that people have in their apps really are kind of copied from other places, they're perpetuated, and, people don't really think about what could be done differently here. And it's really, important to think about this because the experience that you'd love to give the users, the people who download your app, is one where, they show up and everybody knows their name. It's a completely different experience that things are personalized to them. You can keep this user engaged, re-engage them across devices and so on. And, they don't want to be in this situation where they have to explain everything again and again, have to know the secret codes, have to troubleshoot. And so we would love to offer them this kind of, cheers experience. But at the same time, I think, I've given this talk at a Droidcon before, and it was in Europe, and someone made a really good point that, it's not just personalizing to people, it's also keeping this information that they're entrusting with you safe and secure, and also private, that they may come into the bar and you may know their favorite drink, but they may not necessarily want their friends knowing when, they're going out to get drunk, or whenever they're giving you something like payment information. You probably want to make sure that you're keeping that secure, keeping it out of the bad guys' hands. So I think there's an important, variety of aspects to think about in the user experience of a login system. And just to illustrate what some of those problems are today, I think we could look at a pretty typical example. So if you've got an app or a service, you probably have a login screen that might look something like this. So you build for Android here, of course, and you've got a fancy logo that you probably spent a lot of money on, and now you've got a sign in and a sign up button there. And so let's actually walk through this. Like, let's pretend we're a user, and we use my designer here. Her name is Alex, and she sees this app and downloads it and tries to sign up. So it's a pretty standard sign up form there. And so she puts in the username, password that she would like to sign up with, though probably the same one she uses everywhere. And we're counting here how many times she had to manually type this long and hopefully secure password on mobile, and that's the number of ducks there. So we've got 2 so far. We're trying to sign up. And you know what it says? This account already exists. And I'm sure everybody has encountered this at some point. They show up, they fill in the form, they put all this information in, and at the end it says, oh, you've already got an account. And so, of course, we can't always remember whether we have signed up, used this service before. There's a lot of apps out there these days and more coming. And so she goes back and says, okay, well, you know what? I'm going to sign in, and I always use the same username and password, so let me try that one. Not a good practice, Alice. You should not be using your same username and password everywhere. So yes, unfortunately, that is not the right password. Okay, so at this point, most people are going to give up, but Alex is really dedicated, so she's going to go through the forgot password flow, and we've all been through this, which means you need to go flip to your email app, and you need to hope, and half the time it doesn't work. Email ends up in spam, ends up in some sort of folder, and we cannot get this person into our app. They're gone, right? But she's lucky, and the reset password link showed up. And so she's able to, enter the password a couple more times, and hopefully she's signed in at that point. Unless you're looking very carefully here, which is that we've set the password, but we need to actually sign back in one more time. And finally, that was the mobile website because we clicked on a link in the email. You haven't actually signed into the app yet. That's number 7, and we are finally into the food app. So that is the experience for a lot of people who may be coming to your site. So I hope you're thinking about that. And one of the things that I really would love to emphasize is hopefully you're measuring this, that when people do show up for your service, you're seeing how many people are dropping off at each of these stages. And remember, these are the users you may be paying to acquire, the users who really would love to use your service, and they're dropping off. And so I would really highlight, that authentication user experience is complex. And what has happened over the last few years is there's been this big push to add these buttons. There's the Google and the Facebook button, and our team builds one of them, the nice white button there. And we found that this doesn't actually really solve the authentication problem. That for some users who do click the button and they know which button to click and they always click that one, things work nicely. In fact, they've gotten rid of passwords for those users in many cases, so that's good. But the reality is that there's now actually a new problem here, which is there's a set of buttons, and you have to remember which button was it that I pressed last time. And if you come back and you're like, okay, well, let's try this button. Now it's a different one than last time. Maybe there's a new duplicated account. There's all kinds of problems that you could run into. And worse yet, there's actually kind of this taint to the social login that, what happened with Facebook a few years ago is that you'd click that button, all your friends' information goes to this app, it's posting on your wall, and people really have this, notion that when they click one of these social sign-in buttons, other bad stuff's going to happen. And so, in fact, when we do studies and we do user experience research, we ask people, which button would you click? And many times, people would prefer not to click any of them. They'd just rather go with the email and password field. They feel it's more privacy preserving. They feel it's even more secure because they have a password. And so there's really some perception problems here. And at the same time, then there's all these legacy users, people who already had accounts. What are you going to do about them? How do you link when people pick the button and they've already got an account? And then there's this perpetual problem of, well, you have to sign people up and you have to sign people in. You've got 2 copies of your UI, people going into flows where they're not supposed to be, all kinds of problems. And so I think this really highlights that adding another button to your sign-in UI doesn't actually fix problems. In fact, it may create new ones. And I would really, again, hammer home that you should be looking at the performance of these systems, that when someone sees one of these screens across the board, we ask apps and developers this all the time, how many people see this screen and how many actually end up signing in? And in many cases, it's less than half of them. That's potentially half of your users dropping off at this point, half of the people who are trying to buy something, to convert, who are running into problems. And I really would hope that you look at this in your own app and think about, are there some of the principles that we talk about today that could be applied to make this number a little bit better? So here's some of the ideas that I'll talk about today. This is a relatively new talk. I've only given it a couple times this year, and would really love feedback from people in the community who've thought about this, who've tried and experimented things in your own apps to see what works or doesn't work. And we would love to hear the data you've got, see examples, and I'll try to mention a lot of the apps that we've worked with and that do things here well or try new and interesting and innovative things. And no particular endorsement of any of these. Some use Google technologies and some don't, but I think they're all interesting examples kind of on the cutting edge. So to dive into this, basically, I think the first place to start is thinking about where and when are you asking somebody to actually authenticate to your app, to sign in or to sign up. And so, the experience to somebody here who's just downloaded the new greatest food app is probably like, well, what is this food app? Do I really want to try it? And do I have to actually sign up to use this thing? Is this worth it? So I think those are probably the things that would go through your mind when you're thinking about the data and the time and the permissions that you're giving up to install this app. And certainly you don't want somebody to bounce. And so I think there's a couple of good examples out here. I just illustrate them. Captain Train is actually built by some GDEs in Europe. They're good friends of ours. And I think, it's very simple here what they've done. They've added the nice logo, but also just said Captain Train, or now Trainline, I believe, is about buying tickets and getting them in a reliable and cost-effective way. It's very simple, very nice. I think that's something you could easily explore, run variations of, and see how it performs. And then there's a bunch of other apps that we see this pattern of being able to use the app before you sign in or sign up. And so I think the travel and the commerce apps that are out there are good examples of this. What they do is they say, hey, you can make searches, kind of come up with your itinerary, but then it's only when you are going to check out that you actually need to finish creating your account. So you can kind of defer that. You can get better engagement with the users who are trying out your app perhaps for the first time. So another interesting one to think about, and it depends really on the app. In some cases, this helps with overall engagement and sign-up rates. In other cases, we see people still prefer to put the sign-up screen first, and that works best. It depends on the market you're in, the nature of your app, the type of users you have, and so on. So really thinking about variations here and measuring what actually works, but some ideas to consider. And the last is we see all kinds of crazy warm welcomes where you use all kinds of information that's kind of thrown at the user when they download an app. And I think it's really important to think about making sure that the call to action here is clear, the value proposition for a user is clear. And I use OkCupid as an example. We just had lunch with them yesterday here in New York, very data-driven company. And I think, you look at the experience they built here, very simple, very clean, and I'm sure that they are looking very closely at the numbers here. So this is something that I think is a good example of the variations to consider when building a sign-up screen and asking somebody to sign in. So that's kind of like figuring out when to actually ask somebody to sign up or sign in. And so now I think it's getting into the mechanics at this point, figuring out how to get somebody through these flows as easily as possible once they've started them. And so I think there's a really interesting concept here that we call identifier first. And so let me explain a little bit about this. But I think it addresses some of the big problems that I mentioned at the beginning about remembering which method you use to log in, remembering whether it's a sign in or sign up, and so on. And so how this works, and there's a couple of really good examples. I would highlight Pinterest. So Pinterest does great design work, and we've talked to them quite a bit recently too. And what they do is they've removed the sign up and sign in versions of their UI. So they basically unified them together, and it looks something like this. This isn't from Pinterest app. This is actually Instacart. It's the same idea though. There's a continue with Google, continue with Facebook, continue with email option. So the important thing to realize here is there is no sign in and sign up. What they're doing is they're looking at that email address saying, hey, you need to sign in, you need to sign up, and being intelligent about putting the user into the right flow. They've taken the burden of having to make that decision off of the user and put it on themselves, who is, of course, the best position to make sure the user is going through the right flow. In fact, we've seen some examples, and Zillow is a great one if you download their app and actually play with the authentication system. They do something even a little bit more novel, which is before even showing the buttons and the what we call like NASCAR array of sign-in options, they have a picker. This is an Android dialog. There's a system picker, and there's also a Play Services dialog. We call it a hint request if you want to try it out. It's in the Smart Lock suite of APIs and Play Services. And the idea is that before seeing the sign-in screen, they say, hey, hold on, what is your email address? And they could do something very clever with this, which I'll show an example of later, which is based on the email address, not only is it sign in or sign up, it's saying, hey, you've got an existing account and you signed in with Google or with Facebook last time. That's the method you should be using. And so we'll see how that looks, but the idea is that, yes, by asking who this person is first, you can do a lot of really intelligent things. And there's a few other good examples out there. Yumly, Eventbrite, who has, I think, tickets for events like this, basically ask you for that email address first, say you need to sign in, sign up. So identifier first is a very interesting and powerful pattern. We see it also widely used in enterprise use cases where if you're having to refer to some sort of corporate single sign-on system, you can ask somebody what their corporate email address first, send them over to the right sign-on system instead of soliciting them for their corporate credentials in your third-party app. So identifier first is a powerful pattern, but it really then at that point kind of gets us into the main flows, which are sign in and sign up. And I think this is an example of an app that kind of breaks my heart. This is one of my favorite travel apps, a screenshot from them a while ago. And there's a lot of stuff that they ask for when they're having you kind of create an account. And I think the real tragedy here is that it's probably too much to ask for up front. And so there's a few things that you can do to reduce some of the burden on users. So there's, I just simply say, use what you can to make this easy for people. And so I reference this Smart Lock or this Android hint request where you can basically ask an API on Android, hey, I'd like a dialog that has the list of the user's name and email address, and with one tap I can get that I think this is becoming increasingly important. We see pretty good adoption of this recently, even though it's a brand new API. So the Pinterest and the Flipboards and AliExpresses using this to fill sign-up forms. And the important thing, like if you're an Android developer, is that this doesn't require any device permissions. So we have seen people doing this in the past within like an autocomplete of email addresses, for example, to help fill a form. But that required the get accounts permission, which of course, in the Marshmallow runtime permissions world is something that's pretty hard to ask the user for. It comes up with a dialog that says it needs your access to contacts. And so there's a lot of people who will decline that. On the other hand, you show this dialog, it's in context, someone taps on an entry, and that information is returned to your app. Very useful. If there's one thing that you could probably try out just from this talk, it's look at that hint request, try dropping it into your app, using it to fill a sign-up form. And from the numbers that we've seen, people running A/B tests on this, you'll probably get about 20% higher successful sign-ups. More people starting, less typos, and if the form's half filled, then more likely that they'll complete it. So this one's a nice takeaway, and we have a bunch of case studies with the example apps here, but you can just download Flipboard or AliExpress, or there's like a Strava of Europe called Komoot that all do this very smoothly. So that's kind of leads me to the next point, which is if you take that little bit of information, the name and the picture, to create a basic account, the next kind of interesting idea is deferring asking for more information. So instead of upfront saying, I need your address and your payment information, and you need to connect and pull all your friends or get your health or fitness data here in Runkeeper, what they do is they say, okay, one tap, I'm going to create an account with that information that I got from the picker, from a Google sign-in, bootstrap your account, get you in the door. And then at that point, in context later, so once it comes time to share something, add something to your calendar, ship something to you, pay for something, then you can ask for all of this information, as we call it, incrementally later. This is an incremental authorization model. So very interesting to see a lot of apps adopting this. And again, just huge uplift in conversion of the sign-up flow if you're asking for less information up front, and then better conversion ultimately at the end of the day if you ask for something like payment in context. And so, yeah, Runkeeper is a good example of this, but I see this all the time. This is very common in apps to defer asking for information. I think it's a pretty well-known pattern. And then the third one here is just don't let people type a lot of stuff on mobile. And even though this isn't a screenshot from LinkedIn's native app, this is mobile web, there's a decent number of apps who are actually doing user acquisition through a mobile web flow. Somebody clicks on a link, it's their first experience with your site or service, they haven't downloaded the app yet. You may have people signing up. And so there's a couple of really simple tricks you can do to annotate the fields on like a mobile website to say, autocomplete in all browsers should kick in here. It should help this person fill in their name, their email address, and so on. But I'd also call out something about the password field. And so this has been a long-running thing. There's a lot of discussion around the web around patterns for building the password field, whether it should be a repeated masked field, which is kind of the inheritance of the desktop computer world where people might be looking over your shoulder and seeing that you're signing up and you're typing this password in, and you've got to hide it, and you've got to make sure it's right, so you're asking for it twice. But really, I think the interesting thing here, and if you just search for why the confirm password field must die, they'll give you a pretty good argument based on numbers, based on a bunch of examples and experiments that people have run that say that one password field is really what you should strive for, a show hide button. And in fact, there's really interesting ideas there about actually just showing the password when you're signing up on mobile, showing it in clear text, but still setting users' expectations about security, that you can hide the password, or when you unfocus from the field, it will hide, so that people still feel secure, but it was so much easier for them to get the password right in the first place. They only had to enter it once. And then when they come back, there's still the show hide option, so that if it is wrong, they can correct it, they can check it before they submit. And hopefully you just have less people dropping off in these very painful sign-up flows. So check out some good examples there. And the last one that I put in this category is, I think a more emerging idea, which is about maybe even deferring password creation altogether. And so by that, I mean, if you have somebody fill in their email address, and Evernote is a good example, they've done this in the past. You put in your email address, they'll send you an email that says, hey, welcome to Evernote. And if you'd like to set your own password to use later in a different place, you can set it by clicking on this link. So basically, they defer password creation, take it out of the sign-up flow, where nobody wants to create yet another, unique, strong password, or worse yet, they're just going to reuse their their common password that they use everywhere, which at the end of the day, they just may never need for the service that you're using. If they're just on Android, and as we'll talk about in a sec, you can keep them signed in or keep them signed in automatically across devices. They may never need that password, and so deferring this may actually be a net win for your sign-up rates, for the usability of your site, and as we'll talk about at the end, ultimately for the security of the service that you offer. Okay, so that's getting people signed up. But then there's this question of, well, this person's going to come back across devices. They're going to come back on the web, different platforms. How do you get somebody back in, and how to make it that as easy as possible? And so this is actually one of the things that I'm really excited about on Android, at least in the Google ecosystem, and you can use the Facebook and the Google sign-in SDKs to do similar things like this as well. There's the ability to sign somebody in automatically if they have an account. And so how this works on Android is that you save the information somebody used last time. So there's a save dialog that appears, and you can try this in Netflix and Airbnb and TripAdvisor. And it's a Google API right now, but we're actually thinking, based on the success that it's seen, that it's probably headed down towards the framework or as a open source library, where basically as an app developer, when somebody types something into your app or clicks on a button, you call a save API to remember what they did. And when they come back on the next device, so long as that same underlying account where they save this information, their Google account, or in the future, as we think about moving it into a more open position where you can talk to other password managers, you retrieve that information, put back into the fields, click the button for them, and automatically sign them in. And so Guardian does this, and Netflix is probably the biggest one out there. Millions and millions of people just opening up an app on the next device, being signed in automatically, and never having to even see the sign-in screen. So really a pretty fundamental change in the user experience coming back to a new app, or an app after a new install. And I think especially worth pointing out in the publisher case, like the Guardian, where they might not have wanted to block the sign-in screen, block on the sign-in screen when someone had a new install, that they can show content. They could automatically sign you in and show you the article that you were reading last time, or in the case of a travel or commerce site, the piece of content that you need to take action on, your shopping cart, something like that, a checkout button, without having to block on sign-in UI. So automatic sign-in is really cool. Just call this API, get the information. The blue bar shows, check out the smart lock stuff, and working on making this flexible so that you're no longer just calling a Google API, but talking to other password managers that might be on the device to retrieve this type of information stored across devices. That said, there's certain set of people who may never have saved this information before, and so you're going to have to help get them signed in too. I think the ideas of showing some sort of picker for the email address work equally well here. So look at the system or play services dialogues that are used by apps like Zillow. They'll fill in the email address for you. And then, as I alluded to, if you try out Zillow, they do this clever thing of saying, oh, and once I've got your email address, I'm going to tell you how you need to sign in, whether you need to use Google, use Facebook, or enter a password. And so doing as much as you can for the user, signing people in automatically where possible, then remembering how they signed in last time to help them sign in again on the next device. And finally, once you do have somebody signed in, just keep their session active on this device. Mobile apps do this generally pretty well, but the web could still use persistent, long-lived sessions that right now many people time out sessions for security reasons, that there are mechanisms to mitigate the risk on the web in terms of security of using things like OAuth, where you have two tokens. You have a short-lived access token and a long-lived refresh token that you can periodically check for someone's account state while maintaining access over a long period of time if there is no major account changes for that user. Okay, so at this point, there's one other important aspect of signing people in or up that I think a lot of people miss, and that's this account linking problem. That if you come back and you have an account already, maybe it was email password, and you clicked on the Google or the Facebook button, what is going to happen? And that is this problem that if you don't link to an existing account for this email address, you may end up creating a duplicate account for this user, and that's support costs, that's lost data, and that's confused people that you really want to avoid. And so there's actually a lot of apps that do this nicely. Deezer, I think, is one, and I think Uber does it as well, where basically you click on a Google button, it'll say, okay, pick your Google account, and if you pick one that corresponds to an existing email password account, it'll just let you into that account automatically. So it was seamless account linking. You signed in with a different mechanism, but they'll put you back into the existing account. So doing that smoothly is really important. It's also pretty tricky, as I'll show you in a second. So there's a couple ways you can do this yourself if you're going to build an app. I'll mention that. There's also an important security aspect to this, which is if somebody clicks the Google button for a Gmail address, you can just let them in. But if they click the Facebook button, you shouldn't, technically. The reason for that being that Google was authoritative for that email address, the Gmail address is. Facebook is not authoritative for any email addresses. Facebook is just saying, I have a Facebook user here who at one point verified this email address for their Facebook account. They are not necessarily the current owner of that email address. So an important subtle security requirement here that we often see people either don't check for this or have some terrible user experience asking somebody if they want to link accounts, which, who as an end user would know what linking accounts actually means? So thinking carefully about this and doing it securely. And then, one of the other sort of edge case problems that we have seen is that someone logs in with Google or with Facebook and they at some point change the email address for their account, or as we're seeing in the future, things like the phone number for their account. This is going to be an even bigger problem. Someone comes back with a different email address, but they still click the Google button. It's their same Google or their same Facebook account. And so the important thing here is that when you do the Google or the Facebook login, you will get an identifier from Google or Facebook, and you should be keying off of that identifier, not the email address, if you want to be able to get this person back in with the same Google or Facebook account across identifier changes, across phone number or email address updates. And so that's a subtle one that we see cause all kinds of support issues that at the end of the day come back to Google and saying why didn't my Google sign-in work on this new app that I got? And it's because you updated your email address for your Google account, and the third-party apps don't handle that nicely. Okay, so with that, the last kind of big category of advice I try to give out is all of this stuff sounded pretty good. It is tricky to build yourself, and there's a lot of tools out there, especially if you're a brand new app developer, that you can use to avoid building especially things like a username and password database yourself. And so I'll illustrate this, I think, with Firebase, which Google does build. Firebase Auth is a full auth authentication solution that you can get off the shelf from Google for free. But there's a bunch of others that I'll mention here in a minute. And the most important aspect of this, I think, is really the passwords, especially the password reuse problem. It is the one that I want to highlight. So the situation today is that every app developer out there has their own username password database. And as we've seen in the news, and there was very high-profile examples of this recently, as soon as the app developer starts to become a big app, once you have hundreds of millions of users, you become a very juicy target for the bad guys out there who will try very hard to get into your systems, to take your username password database, and hopefully you're hashing and salting that and doing security best practices. But hashed and salted passwords are actually pretty easily reversible. That doesn't offer that much protection. The reuse problem is a huge one, that once this username password database is taken, is stolen, you end up in a situation where someone's credentials from one site can then be replayed on another. And we see all of these high-profile hacks of companies, of places like Sony, of the Democrats' emails, things that end up on the front page of newspapers are facilitated by people getting in one place that is less secure, using those credentials, and making a sort of privilege escalation attack on another surface. And so we've seen actually a number of high-profile sites out there. This is a screenshot from Medium, but I think Slack does something very similar, where they've basically taken passwords off of their balance sheet. They don't have a password column in their user database. If you need to log in, they send you an email and you click on the link in the email to verify your identity. And they don't have a username password database to be stolen. They have a username database, I guess, still, but at least the reuse problem has been addressed there. And there's a bunch of other tricks of this type. I think we could do a whole nother talk on just the security aspects of authentication systems. But there is another talk tomorrow from the guys from Twilio who built Auth, which is a second factor service. And so thinking about things like second factor to mitigate password reuse problems and attacks. But getting out of the business of managing passwords yourself is probably a worthwhile investment. And so there are other things you can do. You can use the Google or the Facebook logins for users who have an email-based account, and we're adding the phone number support, as I mentioned, that basically if they sign up with Google or sign in with Google, you can use the authoritative tokens from Google saying that this is the email user. You don't need to send them an email. You don't need to ask for their password. We are vouching for the presence of this user here. And someone who signs up or signs in this way, you don't need to ask for their password. So don't have them set a password. Use these authoritative identity providers and avoid passwords for those users. And then finally, I think the big takeaway here is that all of the people on the screen here build some kind of system that you can use, some kind of service that can either manage the passwords for you, provide pieces of UI, and that put you in a situation where you're relying on a service built by somebody whose full-time job it is to build authentication systems and keep it secure, as opposed to the part-time job of your one developer who at one point built an auth system and has never been updated. You don't have security experts on staff as a startup, I'm sure, but the people out there who do know everything there is about security and about exploits do have those on staff, and those are the bad guys. Those are the ones who will know exactly what you have not done and how to get into your system, how to take all of this data for your users, how to sell it on the black market, and how to potentially even put you out of business. So I would really emphasize that if you don't build analytics systems yourself or crash analysis systems, like your auth system is another thing that you should think about outsourcing to somebody who does this professionally. And so to illustrate that, how am I doing on time? Do I have... or if I've got a few minutes, I can show you an example just from how we built an authentication system for Firebase Auth. And that is, that we start very simply with, a username password field. If you'd like to use the Firebase service, this is the place to start. And then on top of that, we add, sign up version, and we use that trick of going identifier first, asking for their email address. And then on top of that, we layer, a forgot password link. And so if you're thinking about building this yourself, you might be kind of getting worried at this point that it's starting to look complicated. And now you've added Google and then Facebook button, and so you've got a whole bunch more flows, and you have to do that account linking stuff I talked about. And then you have to add things like the smart lock, the assistive dialogues of saving, retrieving, filling in information. And so it starts to get complicated when you apply all of the principles in these talks to an authentication system you try to build or update yourself. And so I'd really like to highlight that, you have to do this again a few more times on different platforms, that this is probably not something you want to build and maintain yourself. So when we built this for Firebase Auth, and we actually open sourced our implementations of UI on all of these platforms, it was thousands of lines of code. And so you can actually take that like open source library that we've used and put this into your own app as authentication UI using a Firebase backend. But it cuts down the lines of code by about a factor of 1,000 or so. And you can still customize it to make it look like the rest of your app. But at the end of the day, you can see how it works. You can take some of these ideas, and you can use a service for free that offers an entire backend that will store the passwords securely for you, that will implement all of the UI flows, and that will get people into the app quickly and securely. So worth thinking about. It's, I think, interesting just to look at how they work if you go and check out the open source versions. But at the end of the day, applying these principles, you don't have to take them all. You could start with a few individual pieces. You could think about the assisted sign-up flow, the automatic sign-in, running experiments about where and when to ask somebody to sign in, and really get a lot better performance out of the authentication systems that you're building for users. And hopefully at the end of the day, if you do end up using one of these services to help manage your user data, put yourself in a situation where you're not managing username and passwords that will one day be stolen, that will one day be proliferated around the internet. And so with that, I think we're a little bit out of time because we started a bit late, but I can certainly take questions or get people's thoughts. And as I mentioned, you can always just send me an email. You can do that search there that I mentioned for internet identity research from Google, and you can see the slides yourself. And then there's all of the Google APIs that I mentioned that my team builds. The Google sign-in button that can replace the passwords, the smart lock APIs to help fill things in, remember, and sign somebody in automatically next time, and then Firebase Auth, the backend service, and an open source UI for authentication. At the end of the day, I think Google's interest in this is that we would love to see the ecosystem that we support around Android and around the Play Store really be much more effective and usable, and for that matter on the web through search too, that when people land on a new property, open up a new app or website, we would really love to see people be able to use that service to find the information that they're looking for and not end up getting stuck on a sign up or a sign in screen. I think that's really Google's interest in this business. We built these things and they're all for free, and our interest is in making sure that the apps and services out there are higher quality, work better for users, and are more secure. So with that, I would love to take any questions or thoughts that people have, and you're always welcome to come find me after if we run out of time.